Thank you all for coming tonight. We've had a very, very fun day. Bill McNabb has been with us, meeting students, engaging with people across campus, and I'm thrilled that all of you have come to join us tonight for this event. For many months now, we've been planning with great expectation our Leader in Residence event. And when we do this, we're constantly thinking about how can we find a respected, successful leader in our field who is also a voice for what's going on in the world today. And I know that we found that blend with Bill. We're thrilled to have him with us. In his numerous roles at Vanguard, including CEO and Chairman, Bill has had his finger on the pulse of the global markets, more than perhaps any individual the world over. At the same time, Bill has been at the helm of an organization that's built on the foundation of service and accessibility to each and every customer. And we've seen that today, throughout the day, time and time again, as he's taken the time to really meet and connect with people. I believe that leadership begins and ends with influence, and Bill McNabb's an example of influence on many levels. Like you, I'm excited to hear from Mr. McNabb as he shares his stories of leadership and success. I'm sure that we'll leave this place tonight inspired to take his challenges and words to heart. To set the stage tonight, Anna Russo, class of 2019 valedictorian, and a leadership minor and member of the Leadership Living and Learning community at Cabrini University, will lead us in an opening reflection. Anna?
Good evening, everyone. As we gather here tonight, I invite you to take a moment and pause to think of an influential leader in your life. It doesn't have to be someone you know personally, just someone who exemplifies leadership. Some of us may think about a professor, a celebrity, or a boss. Others may be imagining a parent, a family member, a friend, or their favorite athlete. Think about why you picked this person. What stands out about them? How have they had an impact on your life? What is it about them that makes them a leader in your eyes? Chances are, we are all imagining someone different. And while we may have different reasons for looking up to these individuals, I bet we all have one thing in common. We didn't choose these people for their position. Yes, some of us that we thought of may hold positions of power or have great riches and fame. But the reasons we view them as a leader is not solely surrounding their job, title, or position. Ultimately, it's not what they do, it's how they do it. Maybe it is their work ethic, or their commitment to others, or a kind demeanor. Or it could be how they treat their employees, the values and beliefs that they hold, or the positive change that they work to create. As a result of this mindset, I've learned to set goals for not only what I want to do, but who I want to be. To challenge myself to be better, I ask myself these questions each day. How can I be of service to others? Who can I help today? How can I make someone else's day better? Setting these intentions each day has radically changed my attitude of success. When I learned that leadership doesn't require a fancy title or a powerful position, I felt empowered. I could embody leadership in every role that I have, whether it be as a student, a sister, a worker, or a friend. I don't need a title to stand up for what I believe in. I don't need money or fame to make an impact in someone's life. I, as a simple 22-year-old trying to navigate this thing called life, can lead by example by caring for my community, fighting for others, and living with purpose. So, as you go throughout your evening and the next coming days, I challenge you to this. Set the intention to show more kindness, compassion, and patience. Ask yourself how you can help someone else. Find ways to show leadership in the roles you currently hold, no matter how small you think they may be. And lastly, never forget the power you have to make a difference. And now, I'd like to invite Mr. McNabb up to the stage.
So, everybody hear me all right? No. So, Nate did not tell me that I had to follow him. I feel like completely hoodwinked here. Steve and I should just go to a conversation. That was phenomenal, and I'm not going to be able to add that much to that. It's just an incredible way to think about leadership, and I'll try to build on a couple of those points, but that was really, really well done. I can see why you're going to be involved in training. So I thought what we do is, Steve and I had talked about this. I might spend 10, 15 minutes with just a high-level framing of a few issues, particularly around leadership, and then and I'll use a couple of slides just to sort of help out. Then we'll have a conversation, and we'll just talk, and we'll try to cover as many topics as we can. And I want to begin with...
Can't hear you.
You can hear me. All right.
I don't think it's on. I don't think it's on.
How's that? Thank you. Wow. I thought my voice was carrying pretty well. Yeah. So, what I'm going to do is share a handful of slides just to frame it. And I'm going to start with a question. And there's a number of Vanguard people in the audience. And I'm going to ask you guys not to answer this question. Right? So the question is, what is this? And I'm going to give you a hint. It's not a diagram of the greatest play in Super Bowl history. For those of you Philadelphia fans, it is not the Philly special. So this is a diagram of the Battle of the Nile. 1798, Admiral Nelson basically defeats the French fleet. It's the beginning of the end for Napoleon. And it culminates several years later. You might be saying, well, that's really interesting, Bill. What does that got to do with Vanguard or any kind of investing? And what is so interesting about this is Nelson was particularly known for being very bold, innovative, daring, actually rewrote the rules of how to communicate and so forth, how to actually delegate authority among other leaders. His captains were incredibly empowered and so forth. So it was a whole different way of thinking. And one, John C. Bogle, our former late, great founder, Jack just passed away a few months ago, as many of you know. Jack was completely enamored of this story. And he thought about when he was creating Vanguard in 1975, bold, innovation, disruptive, how do we do things differently? And the connection is, Nelson was sailing on the HMS Vanguard. And that's why we're named Vanguard, was because of this story. And if you come to campus, again, my colleagues can share this with you, everything is nautical. We don't have employees, we have crew members. We don't have a gym, we have ship shape. We don't have a cafeteria, we have a galley. And it keeps going, okay? It keeps going. But, one of the things, and we'll get to this a little bit, I'm sure, in the Q&A as well. Establishing culture is an incredibly important thing, and one of the things Nelson was particularly famous for was creating this culture, as I said, of disruption and innovation. And Jack actually looked at that as something that was a really powerful message. So when we were started in 1975, $1.5 billion, 38 people, just down the road, just around the corner actually. And it was the middle of what was at that point the worst financial crisis since the Depression, 1974-75. Horrible time. Terrible time to be an investor. Terrible time to be in the mutual fund business, which was a little tiny sort of slice of the financial sector. And when we were founded, there were really three basic principles. One was, it's not our money, it's the client's money. And we were structured, actually, to reflect that. You may know that one of Vanguard's unique characteristics, there's no other firm in the world, we're owned by the funds, and therefore the investors in the funds. So that was sort of principle number one for Jack. Principle number two was cost actually matters in investing. And this kind of ran counter to all consumer theory at that point. Usually you hear the old adage, you get what you pay for, and the more you pay, the higher the quality, and you have to decide where the value lies. Investing is actually just the opposite. The only predictor of future performance is actually cost. And the lower the cost, typically the better the future performance. It's not a perfect correlation, but it is the best mathematical correlation that there is.
So that was principle number 2, costs matter. And Vanguard's become pretty well known for our structure and very well known for our approach to cost and always trying to leave more for the investor. The third principle, the one that was probably least well articulated, but you felt it when you interviewed, was we wanted to be a great place to work. And we told people that when we hired them, don't come here for a job, come here for a career. They come here for a career. And this people orientation, I think in a lot of ways, and when I was delivering a eulogy for Jack, I said, in so many ways, it's that cultural underpinning that actually I think is going to serve us well as a company going forward, more so than all the other things that Jack pushed on indexing, low cost, our structure, et cetera, et cetera. Because the people thing at the end of the day matters more than anything else. And you're going to hear me say this over and over again. We believe very, very strongly that talent and culture beat strategy every time. I can tell you story after story after story of companies, not only ourselves, but others in other industries where they got the strategy right, but they didn't get the people right, and they ended up failing. I can also tell you a lot of stories where you got the strategy wrong, at least initially, but you had great people, and you're able to pivot, and you're able to actually respond and move. And with this pace of change today, that ability is really critical. And so having the right kind of people, to me, it's the best antidote to all the disruptive change that's going on. So how do you do it? And I'm not going to go through our entire people strategy. I want to focus on sort of leadership principles. And if you were to break down the way we think of leadership, I would say there are 3 categories, if you will, sort of 3 bedrocks. One is this idea of growth mindset and grit, which I will come back to. The second is what I would call level 5 leadership. It's another way of saying servant leader. I loved Anna's comments. The Art of Leadership, Max Dupree, one of the greatest books ever written, talks about servant leadership. Again, in my humble opinion, when we draw charts, organization charts, we draw them upside down. You always see the entry level, and the middle management, and the executive team at the top, and the board above it. It should be flipped the other way. People who deal with customers and clients, they should be at the top. And leaders' job is simply to support them. And it's the whole concept of servant leadership. I'll come back and go a little bit deeper. And then finally, and this one probably, at least for some of the business professionals in the room, maybe the more controversial, we believe high-performing teams trump everything in terms of an approach to leadership. And there are lots of organizations out there that actually have been successful where they have, I'll call it a cast of all-stars, and everybody sort of goes off and you see who survives and so forth. I think if you're going to build something that lasts multiple generations, this idea of a high-performing team becomes incredibly important. So I'm going to just dive into each of these quickly, and then, as I said, we will open it up to Q&A. So, mindset. Has anybody read this book? Carol Buck, you? If you haven't read it, it was written about 15 years ago. I think one of the most important books written in the 21st century. She's a psychologist, originally out of Columbia, I believe, and now she's at Stanford. And she has this whole theory, and there's it's not just a psychology theory, there's actual neurobiology behind it, about growth mindset versus fixed mindset. And just to oversimplify, just to give you a sense, we said this group, on average, we sort of did a distribution of IQ, EQ, et cetera, probably very evenly distributed, right? So if we take this side of the room and we give you a series of tests, puzzles to solve and so forth, and at the end of it, as you're solving them, we tell you how smart you are. Of course, you guys got great IQ, no wonder you absolutely solve these quickly. And then this side of the room, the feedback is different. The feedback is great how hard you worked to get through that. It's great that you persevered. It's great your effort really made a difference. Now play that out over multiple scenarios as you make the puzzles harder and harder. And what the experiment showed was initially the results were pretty similar. But when they got to the really difficult stuff, this side of the room gave up and basically said it's not fair. We're smart, we can't do this, it's not fair. The side of the room that had been rewarded on effort not only said this is great,
I just wish I had more time. Can we, they would try to negotiate for more time. The actual results were different. This group actually did better, even though the two groups had equal talent. And so this idea of a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset, and to me, it's all about, and I talked with a lot of the students this morning or this afternoon about this, the ability to keep learning and to be open to evolving your own capabilities is a critical component of being successful. And in order to do that, I think you need this other characteristic, very technical term, grit, i.e. the ability to persevere. And just down the road, Angela Duckworth, who's a professor at Penn, has done some just groundbreaking work on this, and it's about the ability to persevere. And what she hypothesized, and then has done a lot of clinical work to back up, is that if you take people who are passionate about their purpose, sound familiar? You think about what's going on here at the university. People who are passionate about their purpose, and then they are able to persevere through difficulties, those are the people who are going to be immensely successful. And I think the two go together. I think having the openness to constantly learn and the perseverance to do it are the combinations that really make a difference, is the combination that really makes a difference. And so, if you could test for these things, if you will, you'd never make a hiring mistake as an employer. But you try to make judgments, you try to actually work through characteristics that give you some insight into this. But we believe this very, very strongly. But you could say, and very appropriately, these are not necessarily traits of a leader. These are traits for anybody. And I would agree with that. So these, to me, are like the bedrock traits. Like, you could be an individual contributor. You could be somebody writing code. You could be somebody doing accounting. You could be somebody who works more as an individual contributor. And there are a lot of great roles in the world around that. If you have a growth mindset and you have grit, you're going to be successful. When you take this, though, for our leaders, the second component, if you will, that we look for in leadership is this concept of level 5 leadership. And again, it's another way of thinking of servant leadership. The two, to me, go hand in hand. Has anybody here read Good to Great by Jim Collins? Again, a smattering of hands. So again, to me, I think if you had to pick one textbook in terms of how to run a company, it's probably the one I would pick. It's not perfect, but there's so much great stuff there. And the interesting thing to me are these characteristics that Collins describes. If you apply this to a lot of people who have been pretty successful, they fall short. And what's interesting is if you watch organizations over time, often when the organization can't reflect this kind of level 5 leadership, it may be successful for a period, but it's not sustainably great. And so what are these traits? As you can read, a mix of personal humility and indomitable will. The level 5 leaders want to win desperately, but they're very humble, and they know what they don't know. You have to establish a culture of high expectations. It's not easy. You have to establish a culture of high expectations. Very importantly, ambition is not for self, it's for the organization. This is probably, to me, the single biggest element. If I were a stock picker, one of the kids was asking me earlier about sectors and individual securities that I was interested in. I have no idea. I'm an index guy, right? We just match the market. But if I were an individual stock picker, one of the things I would do is I'd read annual reports, and I'd look at the size of the photo of the CEO. I'm serious. And the letter from the CEO. I actually have done this, so I'm true confessions, even though I'm not investing in individual stocks. But what you find is you'll see someone in these letters, and it's I. I did this, I did this, I did this, and the massive picture and so forth. And it's interesting, somebody actually correlated the company's performance over the next 5 to 10 years. And what you find is the size of the picture and the number of times I is used correlates with bad performance and just the opposite. And it's a simple test, right? And again, we can all think of exceptions and whatnot, but this ambition for self rather than the organization, I think is critical. People say, well, how do you actually put that into practice? So at Vanguard, for example, and when we have new board members, it's really hard. Like, they don't understand this because they all come from different corporations where, how each division does determines, what the bonus pool is going to be for those executives and so forth. Our senior team are all paid exactly the same, not the same dollar amount, but by the same formula, and it's all about how the firm does, not how their individual function does. And again, got a lot of colleagues out here, you all know partnership, right? Partnership is a key part of it's our profit sharing. And it doesn't matter if you're in FAS, our financial advisor group, doesn't matter if you're in our 401k business, doesn't matter if you're a staff accountant, none of that matters. It's how did the company do? And it's a big part of everybody's compensation. So you can actually do things like that to make it real. And then finally, a level 5 leader looks outward to bestow recognition and inward to take responsibility. Again, we've had so many great examples, people I worked for where, I can remember one particular case where I completely screwed up. And my boss goes to his boss, and he's like taking responsibility for it. I'm like, no, I'm the one who made the mistake. But he would never say, oh, my team messed up. It was always, this is my group, we messed up. And it struck me as one of those early lessons you learn and it was just so powerful. So again, this level 5 leadership concept, we think it is the way to think about servant leadership in sort of a specific way. And then finally, this concept of high-performing teams. And this is the one, there's been much less written about this. And again, we had some interesting discussions in some of the student sessions earlier today. The idea, so much of how we're educated, at least in my generation, is, how did you do in your report card? What were your board scores? What's your GPA? It's all about the individual. And then you get, to a place like Vanguard, and it's how did we do as a team? How did we actually perform? And getting that concept takes time. And I think for us as an organization, it was certainly a journey. One of my great mentors, Jack Brennan, who is Vanguard's second CEO, was really the one who pioneered this concept inside of Vanguard, sort of building upon what Mr. Bobo had created. And in order for a team to be truly high performing, you had to have this level of trust among the team players, that people would speak the truth and they would treat each other with great respect, even though they might disagree, which really was the second point, constructive conflict. One of the words that I absolutely hate is consensus. I think consensus has a role perhaps in politics. We're certainly not seeing a lot of it today, but you can argue that it's a practical solution in political arenas. I think in the business world it's depth. Because consensus typically is a less good answer. Everybody sort of compromises to get to the least common denominator, if you will. At least we can at least agree on this little bit of thing, as opposed to what's the best idea. And so when you have a high-performing team who trust each other, they are willing to have very constructive conflict. And then, hopefully the answer emerges from those discussions, but sometimes, the person in charge actually has to make the decision and say, okay, we've heard it, but this is what we're going to do. And then what the great teams do is they all commit. They all commit to the decision, they share accountability, and they share the results. And, again, it sounds simple, but it's really hard to do because, people want to second guess. People want to always look back and say, well, what if we had done it the way I wanted to? I had either the privilege or the bad luck or whatever, however you want to describe it, of becoming Vanguard CEO 2 weeks before Lehman Brothers. Now, for some of the younger folks in the crowd, 10 years ago, 11 years ago now, this was the end of the world as we knew it, at least we thought at the time. So the financial crisis, unbelievably difficult time, the worst situation I think anybody had faced since the Great Depression. And it was a real challenging period, and what made it actually really very navigatable, if you will, was inheriting a team that was just incredible. My predecessor had left this incredible group of individuals, put together this incredible group of individuals as a team, and I can't tell you how many times we meet twice a day during the crisis, and the back and forth and the open discussion. But then when we decided we had to do something, the commitment was unbelievable, and everybody was on board. And there were really big decisions to be made, there were little decisions to be made, but what was incredible to me was I never once saw one of our leaders, in a sense, second guess what the team had decided to do. And you know, if you look at, in a sense, how we emerged out of the crisis. So I mentioned, you know, when Jack Vogel started Vanguard, we served, maybe 100,000 investors back in those days, a couple $1 billion under management. When I joined the firm 10 years later, 1986, we were serving several 100,000 investors, and we had 20 billion. In fact, I remember Mr. Vogel saying to me, "I don't know why you come here, leave Wall Street to do this, and you might get to 25 billion." Jack was always very low key about growth. Today, when we went through the crisis, our assets were about $1 trillion. The market's dropped about 55%. Today we manage $5.5 trillion on behalf of 20 million people, 19 countries, lots going on. And I really think this was the thing that made the difference, was this high-performing team concept. And the idea that we had not just the executive leadership team, but at the time of the crisis, 12,000 people completely committed. Today, 17,000 people completely committed to the mission. And what it does is it makes life a lot easier. When you have that kind of commitment. So for us, this has been, the last part, if you will, of the leadership journey. So, that growth mindset and grit is sort of the personal core traits. The level 5 philosophy, that you're a servant leader first and foremost, and then you're always a member of a high-performing team. We think that combination is an incredibly powerful combination. And it was really exciting to hear the questions from the kids today and some of their own observations about things that they like about the university and that they're looking forward to as they go forward, because I think it really embodied a lot of what I just described. So I'm going to stop. I want to thank you guys for your attention, and then Steve and I are going to do a brief conversation.
On behalf of Cabrini University, the Leadership Institute, and especially the students, I want to thank you for accepting the invitation to be our executive residents and giving of your time. I know that you have lots of offers and to accept it. But most importantly, as I listen to your message, and we all listen to your message, the impact and the message that you give is just so profound yet simple, and one that we really take to heart. So thank you for all the preparation that you've done in your journey as a leader to be here tonight. And on behalf, we have a little token of our appreciation. So here's a little plaque. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom. Tom and I were actually comparing notes. We've coached each other's kids at different points. So it's fantastic what you've done here. So congratulations.
Bill, good to see you again. Steve, good to see you. See you 3 or 4 times today, and talked earlier last week, a couple of weeks ago. If someone is here from facilities or someone else, if maybe you could move this podium back just a little bit. Careful, there's some wires in here, so if you can't, that's okay. But just to get a chance that someone can. I see President Taylor is over there. Thank you, President Taylor, for being here. Well, thank you, Bill. That was very remarkable, wonderful, and insightful. And thank you, Tom. Thank you, Christine, for being here. Joe McNabb and all the folks at Haverford, and the strong Dr. Nate Pearson.
This is not work on.
Hey, that is really impressive.
Well, it's that accountability and teamwork and grit. To be able to do that. So let's go over some of this. First of all, Bill, how did you find Cabrini University today? What's your experience like today?
So, this was a really good day. Tom asked me, I've had the privilege of doing a couple of different university visits over the last couple of years. And I was struck by a couple things. One, I did the students' engagement with different faculty members and each other the living and learning concept, or however you describe that, to me was breathtaking to see the impact of that. I also, I'll say the values-based approach to education and the passion with which people talk about that. Again, that to me was a real positive thing. And then, one of the real delights was the breadth of questions. And they weren't, and I don't want to sound patronizing, they were not the standard, kind of superficial, high-level questions. Some of the kids went really deep on different things that they wanted to know. And, I got into with one of the students who he told me he had a class tonight or he'd be here and I can have him stand up. We were comparing reading lists. And he wanted to go deep on not just one book, but I think I ended up giving him 6 to read, so I think that was full course load. But the level of the questions was really good, which speaks well of the program.
I do think it's interesting. You talked with the Finance Club as well, and earlier today you remarked to me that you had different questions depending on what grade level they were at.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is fun. The Finance Club, we had, I think, one freshman in there, a couple sophomores, and then a lot of juniors and seniors. The seniors were very practical, like, okay, first job, what do I need to do? What are the key things how you would approach that first job, and lessons learned and so forth. The younger groups were much more, how do you think about for whom you want to go to work? How do you pick a mentor? It was interesting to see where people were on their journey, but again, the continuity of just of sophistication in terms of the level of questions I think, to me, it was great, Steve.
Well, thank you. And let's talk about that journey, your personal journey, because I think a lot of times we want to hear the practical examples, the real-world examples about growth and grit and things that you experienced. 40 years ago or so, or even in the 80s, did you think about becoming CEO and chairman of Vanguard, or were you just trying to get a job at Vanguard?
So 42 years ago, just to be, no, 40 years ago, right? I can't even do math. I was a government major, sorry. 40 years ago, actually, Vanguard, I didn't even know what a Vanguard was. I was applying to be a first-year Latin teacher at a boys' school down the road here, and that was my first job, was teaching Latin and coaching 3 sports. And I know I was not hired for my classical language abilities. I was cheap. And, it was 1979. The country was again in a pretty bad recession. Unemployment, I think, was 10.5%. And I was happy just to have a job, and the fact that I had to teach Latin, but I got to coach rowing and basketball and other things I thought I knew something about. So it's kind of a nice balance. But that's how it started. Now, I'm not going to say that's the career path everybody should try to emulate. There's a fair amount of luck involved here, too.
Well, but I think a lot of people, when they look at folks that are at the C-suite level, or CEOs, or chairs, or presidents, and they think, well, you must have started on third base, or you got really, really lucky, and you were almost born into that role. And the reality is often not the case. And you even didn't know you were going to go to graduate school. You wanted to go to graduate school. So I got married very young, and I was actually trying to make the Olympic rowing team. I mean, that was like the life ambition, was like make the national team in rowing. And I was married. My wife was sort of unexpectedly expectant, so our first child was born on our first anniversary. That wasn't exactly the plan, but I can say that here. But it was, so life sort of threw us a couple curveballs, and I had an opportunity to go to grad school, and I actually wasn't going to go. And my wife was like, if you're going to do it, you got to do it now. And my parents were like, they have 4 other kids to put through school, so they were kind of like, look, we'll do what we can, but we can't really pay for you to go to grad school. You'll have to figure this out. We'll try to be helpful. And my father was great. Was like, whatever he's just figure it out. You've got to do this while you've got this opportunity. And so, I ended up doing that. And one of the kids asked me, what was one of the tough things you struggled through?
again, those of you who are old enough to remember this period, student loans kind of got, the whole programs got eliminated in like the 1981, 82 kind of timeframe, sort of Reagan's first term. And it was, so all of a sudden, like, I was living off a credit card for my last couple semesters, which at 22.5%, those of you who aren't finance majors, let me assure you, that's not a good rate. So we went to, it's funny, we look back on that, Steve, Katie and I, and we think actually that was such a formative time for us because, again, the people who were great mentors to us had really said, look, just do whatever it takes to get this education and, keep, in a sense, keep learning and keep growing and so forth. And then we had time, I came out of it, I went to Wall Street thinking, like everybody else, well, at least I'm going to be able to pay back my credit card debt here. And, it did work out that way, but I didn't really love Wall Street, so.
But it's interesting to me, in the description you just gave, you talked earlier about level 5, and you talked about teamwork, and you talked about growth and grit. And all of that is wrapped up in the story you just said. You wanted to grow. You had a team that was a high-performance team. It's called Katie. And your other support people. And you had that fierce resolve that is talked about by Jim in level 5. And so somehow you decided, this I'm going to do, and you're going to grit your way through it. And I think that's an example that everybody can figure out. You can hit a wall, you think it's a wall, and it's either not really there or you can figure out how to break through it, maybe not by yourself. Not everyone has that team necessarily. Yeah. But nonetheless, I think there's a good lesson in it. But we talk to a lot of obviously young people on campus, and some of them will express pessimism about the future, not necessarily about their own personal future, but about the world, about climate change or other large issues, and then they wonder, is it all worth it? Or how do I take these huge issues that seem insurmountable and still have the optimism to go forward? What advice would you give? How to look at it?
Yeah, it's tough. My kids and I talk about this all the time. I've got 4 kids aged 27 to 37 at this stage, and we actually have this conversation pretty often. It's so easy to be captured by the headlines. And, one of the things that I think is so difficult today versus, just when we were growing up is, I don't think the news was any less bad. Again, I'll give you a side story on this in a second, but you're bombarded by it now. And so things that were tough 25 years ago, you read about it once a day, if you read the paper in the morning, but you don't get it 24/7, on your phone, on your iPad, on television. And I actually think that actually is a very damaging aspect of life right now. And it's one of these things I think we're all going to have to train ourselves to navigate. And here's my little, this is like a really weird story, but it'll just shows you what the data say. So I was talking to a group of parents. I went to Dartmouth College up in New Hampshire, and I was a rower there, as you probably picked up, and I was talking to a group of rowing parents. And sort of doing a Q&A, and one of the parents said to me, what was the most memorable thing you did at college? I said, that I can talk about, or, in all seriousness, it was a group of us rode our bikes from Washington, D.C. to Tampa, Florida for spring training. So it's about 1,150 miles. And, we basically packed up our bikes with, sleeping bag and, extra gear and cooking stuff, and off we went. And the mother of one of the kids said, oh my God, she goes, that sounds great, but we'd never let our kids do that today. And I said, well, why is that? And I said, why would you do that? And she said, because, well, back then, of course, she was a lot younger than I was, back when you were doing it, it was so much safer. And I'm like, how do you figure that? And then we sort of just went through it. It was like, okay, we didn't have credit cards. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have GPS. if you look at any kind of crime rate, any kind of accident rate from that period of time, way higher than today. So by any definition, far safer to do this today than to do it, in the 1970s. And my point wasn't to sort of be real macho about it, because we didn't think it was particularly dangerous. I mean, it was fun. We had a blast. My point was, people are so bombarded by all the headlines and all the sort of noise that they were actually drawing false conclusions from all of that sort of non-data oriented information. And I see this happening everywhere. So it's a long-winded way of responding to your question, but I think it's a really important point. I think one of the things that people have to be willing to do is to have a longer-term perspective and put things in the appropriate time frames. And because again, so much of I always say, at least in the business side or any profession really, it's not a sprint. It's a very long race, and you're going at a fast pace. But it's a very long race, and you need to be able to frame things appropriately in order to make the right choices, I think.
Does a leader have to have intrinsically and genuinely an optimism and faith in the future?
So I think so. I mean, was it Mark Twain who used the term "be a possibilitarian"? I love those. I don't think it's spell checks, but I love the concept, right? To me, you have to always be looking at what's possible, and in a sense, okay, we're where we're at today, but how can we build it? How can we make it better? How can we improve? As opposed to looking back and saying, oh, in the good old days and so forth. Because I actually think, again, I don't want to make an overly geopolitical statement here, but if you look at a lot of factors today, so we've got climate change issues, we've got lots of tension in the world and so forth. In the last 20 years, more people have been lifted out of poverty than at any time in human history. I mean, it's just data, right? And you never read that. You never read that storyline. So I do think you got to be optimistic, because I actually think there's a lot to be optimistic about. It doesn't mean that you ignore the challenges, but you have to have some level of faith, I believe, that you can overcome them. I mean, it goes back to the grit thing. I think if people work hard and are really creative and really innovative and are willing to continue to grow, that essentially anything can be overcome.
Almost everybody in the world probably should work at a university for any length of time, because if you meet the students, you will have faith in the future. And particularly if your university is doing the right thing. We see it in Anna. We see it in the other students you met today, the ethics, the accountability, the sense of social justice, the service to others, and the welcoming of others. And we talked about this once before, but there's one thing that wasn't directly talked about in the listing of the three circles, and that's integrity. Is that the foundation?
Yeah, I think, and again, I'm going to quote our late great founder, Jack Bogle. One of Jack's favorite phrases was, good ethics is good business. And he was so bothered by the concept that it was a trade-off. Like, to be successful in business or any endeavor in life, you had to trade your integrity at some level. And he just, again, totally rejected that concept, and he tried to build a company based on that. And, I do think it's, in a sense, it should be everywhere. It should be the top of every slide, certainly, that we put out. For us, it's so imbued in the way we were brought up, if you will, at the company, that it's just the only way to be. And, again, people, I had friends who were working, who stayed behind working on Wall Street, and they kind of roll their eyes when I get on my high horse on this topic. But, it worked. I mean, again, we're sort of proof of that, and I don't think it's an accident. I think during the crisis, what was so interesting, Steve, was so most financial firms, because they didn't know how to navigate the crisis, none of us knew what was coming. Many firms just went underground. They just stopped talking. They put their heads in the sand and just hoped it would all pass. And again, I will say inspired by Jack Bogle, we went out and we actually told people budgets aren't going to get cut for travel. There are going to be no staff redundancies. We had no layoffs during the financial crisis. We purposely went out and told people, your whole mission in life here is to serve our clients. Get out there and talk to them. They're afraid. They're scared. Do the right thing. And, there's no question in my mind that as we emerged that was actually a fundamental tailwind for us. People, you build trust by doing that. And, at the end of the day, when you think about the investment business in particular, Vanguard's original model was, before the internet existed and so forth, was we run a few ads in a magazine. If you like it, you call us on a toll-free number. We'd send you lots of material. And if you like it, you clip a coupon, fill it out, and put a check with it, and send it to a post office box in Valley Forge. I mean, you want to talk about the ultimate in trust. There was no physical building. You didn't know who these people were. We didn't do any TV advertising and so forth. And so this was before, the CNBC and MSNBC and all those things existed. So nobody knew who anybody was. It was an article of trust. And I think, I think business should be run that way. I think trust between a customer and the provider of service or the provider of a product is is absolutely essential to run a great business.
When you look at Mr. Vogel, you look at Mr. Brennan, you look at you see, do you not, an evolution in leadership styles? The company evolved, it grew, and maybe what was required in the early days, Mr. Vogel provided. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, it's interesting. And Jack and I, before he died, actually talked about this a little bit, and I don't think he'd mind me sort of describing it. Jack had this other phrase that he loved, along with good emphasis with business, and he used this phrase, creative destruction. There's a famous economist, Joseph Schumpeter, who wrote about this, and this is way before, this is turn of the century stuff, so, early 1900s. And the idea behind creative destruction is companies have to innovate in order to keep evolving and succeed. And Jack had studied Schumpeter at Princeton and had written about him quite a bit and used him in a lot of his early speeches. And so he was always pushing us as a young leadership team at the time to think that way. And sometimes you've got to be careful what you wish for, right? Because everybody did take it to heart. So, Jack Bogle established in a lot of ways the foundation, the ethos, the principles by which, the core, if you will. Jack Brennan's great genius was to take those principles and say, okay, how do we actually do this for more people? And technology and a different leadership model were really kind of his contributions. And then, our team's approach was, how do we take that team thing to another level? And frankly, how do we go global with it? How do we, do more things for our clients and do it at a scale that no one has ever imagined? And so, but the thing that didn't change, Steve, were the core values, that, we were owned by the client, cost was going to be really important, we're going to do the right thing for our investors. These fundamental principles just did not change. But, there's a phrase, again, I'm going to use the Good to Great book, Jim Collins. He has this yin and yang picture in the book where he says, preserve the core while simultaneously stimulating progress. I think it's actually the right kind of mental image. You have to keep your core values, but you've got to be constantly willing to reinvent yourself. Now, I will admit, I have a huge bias on this, and it may be a product of where I grew up. I grew up most of my life in Rochester, New York, and we had two iconic companies, Xerox and Kodak. And, if you followed, obviously, what's happened with both of those companies, here's the, Kodak in particular, here's the irony of Kodak. Who invented digital imaging? Kodak. And they basically said, we're not interested, we're a film company. And they, were they really a film company? again, it's easy to be a Monday morning quarterback. If I could go back in time, I'd be like praying, like I'd be like, guys, you're not a film company, you're a preserve memories company. And we all take pictures because we want to preserve the memories. We want to look back. We want to, you know, it's all of those things. It's an emotional thing. And if they had defined themselves that way, then they could have kept reinventing how they preserve those memories, and it would have been completely consistent. Yet they define themselves just as a phone company, and so that's why they reject. And when you go back and you read you read all the literature and you read the annual reports from that time frame. So to me, you got to learn lessons from history, right? Because it's going to repeat itself if you don't. And
So what do we do then? Let's take a company, and I thought manual, and you've had like 3 different versions as you grew, at least. And what's the next level?
so, one of the reasons I'm gone is it's time for somebody else to actually, another team to really try to imagine that. And I mean, again, not to overemphasize it, but when you do something for a period of time, and you're successful, people then begin to think, oh, you got the model. And so, one of the things we did while we were coming out of the crisis and through this whole thing is we were actually able to transition to an entirely new leadership generation. So, in a sense, I was the last old guy left. It was, everybody else was like a whole generation younger. And it's interesting. The first thing our new CEO, Tim Buckley, did, the very first thing is he handed out a book to the leadership team called The Founder's Mentality. And it basically says you have to think of yourself as an insurgency. And his question to everybody, and I think, again, my colleagues can talk about this probably better than I can, was, are we still an insurgent? And, I had people come rushing into my office, and they're like, oh my God, Tim's like talking about we got to be a revolutionary again. And yeah, the board knew what he was doing when, they selected him to succeed me, because that's exactly what he should be doing. He should be questioning, and the team should be questioning everything we do. And some of the things that made us successful, tactically, not the core values, but some of the tactical things we did, they're not going to work going forward. So, having a fresh set of perspectives. I think every company has to have a process and a framework that allows that to happen. And it's hard. I mean, how many companies have been leaders in their industries for a mere 100 years? Think about it. The millions of years that human existence, right? You can't name more than a few. And it's really hard to do, because what makes you successful often is the first thing that leads to complacency setting in and so forth, and then you end up becoming irrelevant. And I think we got to be paranoid about it.
Well, speaking of being paranoid, how do we deal with, so take this date, for example, April 3rd, 1973, 46 years ago. A phone call was placed by a Motorola employee to Bell Labs in New Jersey. It was the first mobile phone call. On this date in 2010, Apple introduced the iPad. 2 examples of technology that have revolutionized the world. Do leaders today understand the impact of technology on their employees, their customers, and on society? And what advice would you give to people as we go forward in a world with AI and everything else? How does one, it's almost like there's another circle that's needed.
Yeah. So it's a great question, and actually it was one of the real fun questions, related questions that one of the student groups we got to talk about. So, if you think about it, you'll hear commentators say that change feels like it's faster now. And actually they're right. This is a case where actually the common wisdom is correct. Because Moore's law, which is, the power of a chip the same size doubles every 18 months. Think about that, that's an exponential equation, right? If you draw that, it starts out looking like a straight line and then accelerates. And, we're now 40 years into microchips or whatever, so we are in a steep part of the curve where these changes are coming really rapidly. So when people say it feels like like the cycles are shorter, they are, because the technology keeps getting better and better. Now, will we reach an inflection point where that slows down again? That was one of the student questions. I don't know. I certainly don't know the answer to that. But to me, you could spend all your time trying to figure out exactly what that next great technology is going to be. I think it's a fool's errand. I think it's really difficult to do that. Or you could go back to one of the things that was so exciting about the program today and what Tom and you all have done here from a leadership standpoint. Go back to, you put really great teams together. This is where I think talent beats strategy. And the trick is to develop business models that are fast and adaptable. And so, you know, again, in early part of my career, one of the great things you wanted to do was you wanted to lead a big program. Like, you know, you'd see the future service that was needed, and it was going to cost tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, and you wanted to be in charge of that, and you had a 3-year plan, and you know, you'd roll it out. I think that kind of thinking is going to kill companies going forward, including us if we're not careful. There was a book written a few years ago by a guy named Eric Ries called The Lean Startup, and I actually think he has it pretty right. And the idea here is you have to think of yourselves constantly like a venture capitalist, and you're always, in a sense, you're trying to deliver new things as quickly and as efficiently as possible, test, iterate, launch again, retest, iterate, launch again, because the speed with which you can get customer feedback, the speed with which you can actually enhance what you do is so much greater. It's a different way of thinking, and I don't think enough business schools teach this. I don't think enough leaders are actually embracing this. And you see the companies that do it well, they're actually making a lot of progress. And the companies that don't do it well are actually struggling. And actually there's a little bit of more of a winner take all in the business world today. I think some of it has to do with this, that the ability to iterate quickly has become a huge differentiator. And you know, again, the more successful you are, the bigger you get, the more complex you get, the harder it is to do it. And you know, again, I know, again, at Vanguard, I know we're really paranoid about this because it could happen just like that if you're not careful. And I think, you know, there's so many examples of it out in corporate America today.
I was concerned about failure affecting the ability to allow the creativity that will inevitably lead to some failure to have success.
So you want to fail small. You want to fail a lot, actually. You want to fail small. So again, I haven't spent as much time in the venture capital world as there may be people in the audience who've done more. But you know, when you look at what a typical VC does, you know, especially as early startup investors, they will look at 1,000 business plans to get to 10 things that they might invest in, and maybe one of those actually works. I mean, you're starting this wide, and so there's a lot of failure. And so one of the things that we're trying to, you know, encourage people to do is to think of new ways of doing things. Like, you know, what's the minimum viable way of getting it to market quickly? So again, I'll call us out on this. So it's probably about 4 years ago now. So you mentioned smartphone, right? So we had one of our, 2 or 3 of our young millennial leaders who were just emerging. I mean, just coming out of, you know, second year of Vanguard, just getting their first leadership role. We had like a contest, or something like a hackathon. You could, you know, create a new business model and present it to senior leadership team. One group came up with this app for millennial investors, and it was basically, how do we take Vanguard.com, which is, I think, pretty easy to navigate. Some of you may challenge me on that. I mean, there's thousands of pages, right? So how do we take Vanguard.com and get it to 3 screens? Because, you know, as a 23-year-old, all I want to do is put my money in a target date fund. I just want to know if I'm on track or not. And that's all I care about. I mean, should I be saving more or less? And so, you know, they presented it and they came up with really cool screens and really cool ideas. And you know, our retail business, who serves individual investors, nodded and said, hey, that's really interesting. It's like priority 36 on a list of 25. So we'll get around to it in 5 years. Well, in 5 years, you know, So our chief technology officer and I kept a little, we always have a little kitty, if you will, for fun projects. So we said, tell you what, you guys want to give up your day job for a couple months? We'll give you like 4 months to build this thing. And they did. They built an app in like a month. They had 100 or 200 clients testing it within 2 months. And we were getting all kinds of great feedback. And, I don't know whether or not it actually is ever going to amount to anything. The point was, it was a different way of looking at it. And, immediately, like, as soon as I saw it, I spent most of my career in the 401k side. I was like, this would be great for 401k investors because most 401k investors are now using just a single fund, a balanced fund, and half of our 401k investors. So what a great app this would be for our 401k clients, where a lot of the clients aren't that sophisticated anyway. So it would be, you could start to see all the applications, but how do you do that? So we actually created an innovation center and basically said, hey, we're going to put X, millions of dollars and some really smart people, and they're going to fail a lot. And they're going to start things, and then the trick is not to get so wed to something when it doesn't work the way you thought and to move on. And that's the hardest part of the discipline. It's easy to come up with the new ideas. It's harder to shed the ones that don't work. And you've got to have that discipline. So we're trying to do it. We're trying to create a culture that accepts that, because you're going to fail when you do this. And if you don't accept that, then you'll never do it.
And would it be fair to say that older, whatever older is, managers need to have more confidence in newer employees, younger employees? And so 1986, you get hired at Vanguard. I don't know who the person was who interviewed you, but probably in their 40s or 50s, maybe the last one. 30s.
It was a couple of people, yeah.
So I don't know if you know this, but Bill is a very wide taste in music, from old Gaelic to Gothic punk. Okay. Now, can you imagine if your interviewer found out that you like Gothic punk? So, I mean, if that interviewer wasn't like Susie Sue or Robert Smith or The Cure, right? Would you have gotten that job? But you turned out to be you.
It's a good thing they didn't ask me any musical questions. I think I play that back in my head and think about how that would have gone.
But that's kind of the point. I mean, how do leaders, managers in a company shed themselves of their prejudices when they are looking for talent and getting the right person?
Yeah. So look, I think again, it's interesting when you look at how a lot of companies hire. They move more toward algorithms and things that tend to screen. They tend to do exclusionary screens, like if your GPA is not X and if your this isn't that. You don't have a certain number of clubs and all this stuff. I think it's actually backwards. So I sort of agree with your premise. For me, what you're looking for, again, if I could figure out how to test for growth mindset and grit, I wouldn't care what anybody's GPA was or what their major was. If I could test for those two things, I would bet on our ability to win more than lose. But none of us has figured that out yet. I think you've got to cast a wide net. I'm a huge fan of liberal arts. I think actually it's great to have people with technical background. It's also great to have people with classics background. It's great to have people who are really interested in music. It's great to have people who are really interested in theater. It's great to have people who have great athletic experiences. I think you have to cast a very wide net. And again, what you're really looking for are people who can get behind the mission, who are going to work really hard, who are going to continue to learn, and you have to cultivate that. And what you have to be able to do, in a sense, is you've got to be able to demonstrate that it works. Because at the end of the day, people actually do look. They want to know, how does this work? And again, we're not perfect. We've made a lot of mistakes in the hiring side, but if you look at our senior team today, it's a pretty diverse, from every measure of diversity, including experiential. And they just bring different perspectives. And again, our success versus other competitive firms, I think, is partly a reflection of that. And what you have to be willing to do, though, is you have, again, this goes back to this high-performing team thing, the constructive conflict and the the shared accountability, the broader and more diverse the group is, the harder it is to do that, because you can't let it get personal. And I think a lot of people shy away from it because they're like, well, if I get people who think a little bit more like me, it won't be as confrontational. But if you can manage that appropriately, the broader and more, the greater breadth you have from an experience standpoint, the better the results are going to be. And again, if you were to look at any cut of our senior team, academic background, ethnicity, gender, experience, college major, any measure, it's going to look broader. I think I can say this with a lot of confidence. I can't prove it. I think it's going to look broader than any major investment firm in the world. And we didn't set out to do it just to say that. We set out to do it because we thought it was a winning strategy. And again, the proof is in the pudding, I think.
Well, next time, I think there are about 2 or 3 more questions, but you mentioned athletics earlier. What role does, I find it interesting, the 2 of your favorite sports, and you like basketball, you like other things, but are rowing and cycling. And one is individual, and one is very team-oriented. Can you talk about, one, maybe the value of having exercise and physical activity in your life, particularly as you're a leader, but also if one of those sports or another also contributed to your being successful?
Yeah, I was really lucky. Growing up, I grew up in a household where I always joke that my dad was he was the passionate one about sports. He loved everything athletic. So, and he had been he'd been much more of a student, but he just loved the athletic side of things. So he pushed us to just enjoy athletics. My mother was the one who had sort of the, and she was not naturally athletic, but she had sort of that drive and the willingness to work hard. And it was interesting how it all manifested among my siblings and me. I grew up playing mostly traditional stuff. I didn't pick up rowing until I got to college, and it was really because I wasn't a good enough basketball player to play Division I. Let's be blunt about it. You get there, you have all these aspirations from the coaches. I'm like, maybe you'll make the team, but you'll be at the end of the bench. And my roommate convinced me to go to a learn to row day. And, so I did, and just sort of fell in love with the sport. And it wasn't even a great natural fit initially, but, to me, the team orientation of rowing. So I don't know if you got any ex-rowers out here, but it's as competitive a group of people as you're ever going to meet. Like we would, when we get in the weight room, or we go out running, or we get on bikes, the drive to beat each other and prove who was, the hardest person of them all was unbelievable. But when you got in the boat, the only thing that mattered was how fast the boat went. There was no individual statistics. And it didn't matter if I could lift more weights than my teammate, or if he could run faster than I could, or he could get a faster score on the machine than I could. The only thing that mattered was whether the boat went faster and were actually able to beat the competition. And so, that's where you had this shared accountability and the shared results concept. And, Steve, I think I learned more doing that than in any academic pursuit in college. That may be a reflection of my own academic weaknesses and so forth, to be very fair. But it was an incredibly powerful lesson. And, I found those reflections actually are what have driven, a lot of, at least the way I think about it. And it's really interesting. Jack Brennan, who I'm still very, very close to, we had similar team experiences. He was a great lacrosse player and ice hockey player, a two-sport athlete in college. And, it was less the athletic thing, it was the team orientation. And I've seen people with, who were part of theater groups, musical, we've seen some amazing team orientation, like people who played in an orchestra. So I don't think it has to be athletics, but it is that concept that as an individual, you're still striving to be the best at whatever you do, but success is actually not measured by that. Success is measured by how the group does.
I think it's interesting that Mr. Vogel will be proud of you, Admiral Nelson will be proud of you, so you went to the HMS Vanguard, and you continue that with the rowing team. No, well, painful.
You know, it was certainly one of the things that attracted me, you know.
Lastly, there's something that I think, if I may speak for you, that you really state to me that is important as a leader, and that is giving back. Can you talk a little bit about that, about your own interest that you and Katie had in philanthropy and how you approach it?
Yeah, you know, this was, it's so interesting that you asked this because my sister was actually visiting this weekend, actually. And she said to me, where did you and Katie get your philosophy on philanthropy? Because, you know, we didn't grow up with, you know, we grew up in a comfortable setting, but we didn't grow up with that much. And, you know, we didn't have real life examples of it and so forth. And I will tell you, the person who taught me the most about this, there really were two. One was a rowing coach who was a mentor to me on so many different dimensions. And he just had this philosophy that we were all kind of won the lottery of life to be born here and, you know, live here, and we needed to do something to try to make the world a better place. And he just never stopped sort of imbuing that to us. But the more practical was actually Jack Brennan, you know, my predecessor as CEO. And Jack and Mr. Bogle had a part of this too. It was really the two of them when we first started out. At that point in time, Vanguard's philanthropy was pretty much funneled through the United Way. But Jack Bogle stood up, and Jack Brennan stood up right behind him, CEO and president at the time, and they basically said, "You guys are the leaders of the company. You know, we're never going to know what you give, but we expect you to give." And they actually got very explicit with the amounts, and some people were quite offended by that. And, you know, they were, you know, put off, you know, this is different, you shouldn't be telling me what to do. And they weren't. What they were doing was they were trying to, in a sense, teach, because there were a lot of young leaders in the group. And I remember following up with Jack Brennan on this and just asking him, "How do you think about this?" And he goes, "You know, Kathy and I try to, in a sense, tithe ourselves, you know, and no matter what our income level was, we were going to set a certain amount aside every year for charity, no matter what we make, and we're going to try to, you know, be very thoughtful about how we deploy that." And my wife, who is way more strategic about this than I am, you know, she immediately went to that model, and, you know, so I was describing it to her, and Katie was like, this is how, you know, we should try to conduct ourselves. So, you know, what you try to do is you know, again, you're incredibly fortunate. You try to give back financially where you can. I think even more important than the financial thing, though, is the idea of giving of yourself and giving time and giving opportunity. And so, you know, to me, there was the financial thing. That was, in some ways, that's the easiest thing to do once you sort of set a discipline around it. We were encouraged as young leaders at Vanguard, and we still do this, for people to actually get out and do something in the community. And my boss at one point told me, he goes, "You need to go on a nonprofit board." And it wasn't like you're going to get fired if you don't, but it's really important to us, you know, that you find something outside here that you're passionate about. And, you know, for me, it was, again, these kind of lessons. I feel really lucky that I had people who were willing to actually be that explicit and sort of tell you that kind of stuff directly. You know, too often it doesn't get talked about. And, you know, for me, at least, it was very, very formative in terms of how we approach things. And, you know, for us, you know, again, just no mystery in it. If kids are involved, we're usually really interested. You know, we have a thing on education in our family that's really big. And, you know, some of you know, I know my colleagues know, I'm chair of the Philly Zoo, and that, you know, so I'm pretty big on the wildlife side of that, and the conservation side. But it actually started with the kids. It was seeing the school buses, and that's how I initially got involved, was in helping support, you know, the kids programs there. And so for me, you know, that education thing has been kind of a constant.
Well, Bill, we could go on. Thank you very much. I know Nate wants to come up and say the final word or two, but thank you very much for sharing.
you so much, Bill, for your time. Thank you, Steve, for conducting that conversation. It's wonderful. Wonderful to be with you all tonight. My mind is spinning. Integrity, innovation, team, growth mindset, so much more. Grit. We can think about all of these things, and the challenge for all of us, I think, is to take these and process them, and then to apply it in our day-to-day life. So thank you again. I want to thank Carrie DiNardo, our leadership coordinator at team, Tom, for your vision for the Nerney Leadership Institute from its inception, and to the Nerney Leadership Advisory Council, who have been so instrumental in putting together this program. Kirk Gorman, especially, for having cool friends. Thank you for connecting us with Bill. Everyone, have a great night.